All right, now to the $100 million law enforcement boost for police hiring. You may recall this was part of the 2025 budget. It was touted quite a bit by Governor Bob Ferguson, who you may recall ran his campaign before he was elected into office, promising to make public safety a top priority. It was very pro law enforcement, he was at the time. And then the legislation that passed last year did set aside this $100 million for law enforcement. Ended up being a pretty complicated bill as passed, though. It said, you cities and counties can access a piece of the pie, which, by the way, $100 million is not going to be nearly enough to address the critical shortage of law enforcement we have here in Washington State, where we are 51st, very bottom of the pile, even behind District of Columbia, per capita in the nation for numbers of law enforcement based on our population. But the bill that ended up being signed by the governor had a lot of strings attached, and that's what's created some of the problems. So we've got 281 cities here in Washington State, 39 county sheriff's departments some of them wanting to access the funds, others not so much because of the strings that were attached. The cities asking for a chunk of this $100 million for law enforcement had to agree to raise their local sales tax so that once the initial grant is used up, say you get $150,000 for a new police officer for your jurisdiction, the ongoing sales tax revenue is intended to say, okay, you can continue to fund that salary and benefits even after the grant funding is used up. But those cities also had to meet a number of different criteria. They had to follow model policies on various subjects, like how you'll conduct your training, how your crisis intervention will operate, how you will de-escalate at a scene, how you will collect your use of force data. So a number of hoops, if you will, for cities to agree to jump through before they could say, okay, we've done A, B, C, D, E. Now we want access to some of this funding. I spoke to Derek Nunnally, government relations advocate for the Association of Washington Cities today. He told me, it's been frustrating for a lot of their members. Some cities, he said, didn't want to slap that additional sales tax on already overtaxed communities. Others didn't like the mandatory training and the data collection aspect requirements. And others have said, okay, we're going to jump through the hoops. So come on, let's do what we can and get this money. But they've been unable to yet access a single dime of that $100 million. So I did speak with Representative Matt Marshall of Eatonville about this. And here's part of that conversation.
So right now, there's $100 million of grant funds for law enforcement training due to our critical shortage of law enforcement in the state of Washington. It was provided last year via House Bill 2015. And to date, I'm not aware of a single dollar that's been able to be accessed by any of our law enforcement agencies in the state of Washington. This year, I was approached by leadership out of Lacey and Thurston County asking for some assistance with some operating funds for a new regional training center that they have constructed and is ready to put through 2 new basic law enforcement classes this year. They have not found a way to access that money. And so I ran a proviso request attempting to access that money so we can address the critical shortage of law enforcement officers. It was denied. I ran it as a budget amendment recently, and that was denied. We have the lowest law enforcement officer per capita in the country to include DC. We are 51 out of 51. And currently there's a massive backlog for training new recruits. This is a turnkey ready solution that all we need to do is provide just over $1 million for operating expenses. And there's an account dedicated for this with $100 million in it that is not being used. So I'm not sure what the resistance is. Public safety, the public, our taxpayers, they deserve to have the law enforcement officers that their tax money is supposed to be funding.
So as he mentioned, they've got this training facility, brand spanking new in Lacey, ready to get these recruits going. They need just over $1 million to launch this thing, and they have not yet been able to access that money. I did reach out to the governor's office for comment on this. I did not get a response from the governor's office, which seems to be sort of a recurring theme of late. I reached out to the Criminal Justice Training Commission and did receive a response via email from David Quinlan, the communications manager at the Criminal Justice Training Commission. And he said, and I'll read from this, he said, regarding the city of Lacey, we've not heard back from them. He asked me to pass on some information about the issues they're experiencing. So I'm going to do that. He said, we'd love to hear about that and address any of their questions. And then he said, the first round of applications is open now through March. The Criminal Justice Training Commission expects to decide on awards within weeks of that deadline, but apparently only a handful of departments have applied. So that's what I got back from the Criminal Justice Training Commission. I also got an update this morning from Representative Brian Burnett, former Chelan County Sheriff. He's in the know on this stuff, and he told me that he's had all kinds of departments reaching out to him, asking questions, raising some of their frustrations in accessing this grant funding. And he just coincidentally had a conversation, he said, with the governor's office about this morning. I caught up with him outside a House Appropriations Committee hearing just a couple of hours ago. Here's what he told me.
But, going back a couple months ago, I had chiefs of police reaching out to me saying, hey, what in the world's going on? What do we have to do to get this done? And they're really frustrated. I mean, when you have like the city of Kent, who's always been like a model policy agency, to be able to say, hey, we've done this, this, and this. And it seemed like maybe in the process, in normal grant funding, you actually get awarded points when you already have certain policies in place and you can prove that you've been doing these programs and different things like this off the checklist. That was not the case with this funding mechanism. Obviously, the fact that here we are almost a year later and there hasn't been any checks wrote to those agencies to move this programming forward. There was a big question of, was it a rush? Was it a hurry? What were the checks and balances that just weren't right? And I think for me, Carla, is moving forward is like, let's put grant funding and policy in place that doesn't make it difficult for the law enforcement agencies, because the whole point was to get that $100 million out there to be impactful, to be effective. And if you delay the process, how is that making it impactful and effective? We shouldn't be making it harder for our law enforcement leaders. We should make it doesn't have to be easy, but it should be a process that's not hard to understand and to navigate through, especially when you're a model policy agency.
So another issue here is with how the legislation was drafted. It says that this money, this $100 million, has to be used up by 2028. And we are already more than a sixth of the way through 2026, and not a penny has gone out. So there's kind of a sense of urgency here. Some left-leaning cities have already opted to, implement the sales tax, hoping to gain access to the funding, but they also haven't been able to use a single dime of this money as yet. The money can be used for more hiring of officers, but here's the other thing. It can also be used for broader public safety efforts, mental health crisis responders, emergency management planning, community assistance programs. And they drafted it that way. Democrats who crafted the legislation crafted it that way because it appeased some progressives who didn't really think it was a good idea to add a single new law enforcement officer. They said adding more cops is not going to do anything for public safety. So there is, still a lot of confusion about how the program will be implemented. Again, as I mentioned, the Criminal Justice Training Commission has a handful of applications that they're wading through right now, and the current application period won't close, I think, until the end of this month, until the end of March. So we'll see how the initial grants that are allotted out to cities and counties, who was approved, who's taking advantage of this and why, and more conservative cities and law enforcement agencies choosing not to. Why are they not? And how are they addressing the shortage of law enforcement in lieu of accessing some of this grant funding? So at this point, you got a big pot of money sitting there ready to be taken advantage of, but plenty of obstacles, it seems, still in the way, even for those who are willing to impose the sales tax in their communities. So a lot here. I know I threw a lot at you. And that's it for today's episode of Washington in Focus Daily. 50 days down, 10 days to go. I wish I had the bandwidth and the time really to cover more of what's happening here. But I do thank you for watching another episode of Washington in Focus Daily. And we'll see you again tomorrow.